Imagine if Hitler had gotten the atomic bomb first. It's February 27th, 1943. Deep in the mountains of Nazi-occupied Norway, 9 men are about to attempt the impossible. Their mission: stop Hitler from building a weapon that could win the war and reshape human history forever. This isn't a Hollywood fiction. This is the true story of Operation Gunnerside, the mission that saved the world. And it almost failed. To understand why 9 commandos would parachute into a frozen wasteland to blow up a factory, we need to go back to 1938, because that's when everything changed. In December 1938, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved something extraordinary. They split the atom. Nuclear fission. It was one of the most important scientific discoveries in human history. But within months, the implications became terrifying. Scientists around the world realized that splitting atoms could release unprecedented amounts of energy. Enough energy to power cities or destroy them. By 1939, Nazi Germany had conquered Austria and Czechoslovakia. They controlled some of the world's best scientists and most advanced laboratories. And now they knew how to split atoms. The threat was so severe that Albert Einstein, a pacifist who had fled Nazi Germany, wrote an urgent letter to President Roosevelt warning him Germany might be building an atomic bomb. America needed to build one first, but there was one problem. To build an atomic bomb, you need a very specific ingredient, something incredibly rare and difficult to produce: heavy water. It looks like ordinary water, feels like ordinary water, but at the molecular level, it's different. Instead of normal hydrogen atoms, it contains deuterium, a heavier isotope of hydrogen. Why does this matter? Because heavy water can slow down neutrons in a nuclear reactor without absorbing them. It's the perfect moderator for creating a sustained nuclear chain reaction, the heart of an atomic bomb. And in 1940, there was only one place in the world producing heavy water in significant quantities: the Vemork hydroelectric plant in Rjukan, Norway. Vemork wasn't just any factory. It was built into the side of a mountain, 600 feet above the Mona River Gorge. The plant used enormous amounts of hydroelectric power to produce hydrogen, and as a byproduct, heavy water. Before the war, Vemork produced about 12 kilograms of heavy water per day. It seemed like a small, specialized operation for scientific research. Nobody imagined it would become the most important target in all of occupied Europe. But on April 9th, 1940, everything changed. Germany invaded Norway. Within weeks, Nazi forces occupied the country, including the Vemork plant. And almost immediately, German scientists ordered production of heavy water to be dramatically increased. The Allies' worst fears were confirmed. Germany wasn't just interested in heavy water. They were stockpiling it. The Nazi atomic bomb program was real. The clock was ticking. If Germany succeeded, they would have a weapon, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Cities could be vaporized in seconds. The Allies would have no choice but to surrender. Someone had to stop them. But how do you destroy a factory built into a mountain, defended by German soldiers, in the middle of Nazi-occupied territory, in one of the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth? The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, knew that Vemork had to be destroyed. But they also knew it was nearly impossible to reach. Look at this location. Vemork sits at the bottom of a deep valley, surrounded by mountains. In winter, temperatures drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Blizzards can last for days. The nearest town, Rjukan, is small and heavily guarded by German troops. There's only one road leading to the plant, and it's patrolled constantly. A single suspension bridge crosses the gorge, also guarded. The plant itself is surrounded by minefields and floodlights. Inside, German soldiers are stationed 24/7. The SOE needed local knowledge. They needed Norwegians who knew this terrain, who could survive the brutal winter, who could move invisibly through their own occupied country. In October 1942, 4 Norwegian commandos parachuted into the mountains near Rjukan. Their mission was called Operation Grouse. They were the advance team. They would scout the target, establish a base, and wait for the main sabotage force to arrive. The 4 men were Jens Anton Poulsen, Arne Kjelstrup, Knut Haugland, and Klaus Helberg. All experienced skiers, all intimate with these mountains, all willing to die to stop the Nazi bomb. They landed in a blizzard. Their equipment container was lost in the snow. They had limited food, limited ammunition, and winter was closing in fast. For weeks, they survived in the mountains. They moved constantly to avoid German patrols. They hunted reindeer to stay alive. They endured temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in hours. And they waited for the sabotage team to arrive. Through it all, radio operator Knut Haugland maintained contact with London, transmitting weather reports and intelligence. The sabotage mission was coming. They just had to survive long enough to guide them in. On November 19, 1942, the sabotage force finally departed from Britain. Operation Freshman. 2 gliders carrying 34 British commandos, towed by Halifax bombers, flying through the night toward Norway. The plan was to land near the Grouse team's position, join forces, and assault the Vemork plant. But the weather was worse than anyone had anticipated. Heavy clouds, ice forming on the wings, zero visibility. What happened next was a tragedy. Both gliders crashed. One slammed into a mountain, killing everyone instantly. The other crash-landed, and survivors were captured by German forces within hours. Under Hitler's commando order, which declared that all captured commandos were to be executed, the survivors were tortured for information, then killed. All 34 British soldiers were dead. Operation Freshman was a complete disaster. The Germans now knew that the Allies were targeting Vemork. Security at the plant was immediately increased. Guards were doubled. Patrols were intensified. In the mountains, the Grouse team received the devastating news. The mission had failed. Their comrades were dead. And now they were trapped, deep in Nazi territory, in the middle of winter, with the Germans hunting for anyone connected to the raid. Most commanders would have called for an evacuation. The mission was compromised. The men should come home. But Churchill made a different decision. The mission was too important. Vemork had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. He authorized a second attempt. This time, there would be no gliders, no massive force. Instead, a small team of Norwegian commandos would parachute in, link up with the Grouse survivors, and sabotage the plant themselves. It would be the most dangerous special operations mission of the entire war. The men chosen for this mission were extraordinary. 6 Norwegian commandos, all trained in Scotland by the SOE, all volunteers, all fully aware they might not return. Joachim Ronneberg, the leader. Just 23 years old, but already recognized as one of the most capable operatives in the Norwegian resistance. Calm under pressure, brilliant tactical mind, natural leader. Knut Haukelid, the second in command. Tough, resourceful, with deep knowledge of explosives. Frederick Kaiser, Kasper Edlund, Hans Storhaug, and Birger Strömsheim, each one an expert skier, trained in sabotage, conditioned to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. For months, they trained in the Scottish Highlands. They practiced demolitions until they could place charges in complete darkness. They skied for hours in blizzard conditions. They studied detailed models of the Vemork plant, memorizing every room, every corridor, every possible entry point. Their target was specific: the heavy water concentration cells in the basement of the plant. 18 cells containing thousands of liters of heavy water. If they could destroy these cells and contaminate the product, they would set the German atomic program back by years. But there was a problem. The concentration cells were in the most secure part of the facility, in the basement, surrounded by German guards, accessible only through a heavily defended entrance. The Germans had learned from Operation Freshman. They added landmines around the perimeter. They stationed guards at every entrance. They installed floodlights covering every approach. They even placed machine gun nests overlooking the suspension bridge. Vemork had become a fortress. Attacking it head-on would be suicide. Ronneberg and his team would have to find another way in. On the night of February 16, 1943, a Halifax bomber took off from Scotland carrying 6 men who would attempt what many thought was impossible. The flight was long and dangerous. German fighters patrolled the Norwegian coast. Anti-aircraft guns protected key installations. If they were spotted, they'd be shot down before reaching the drop zone. But luck was with them. The bomber reached Norway undetected. Below, the mountains stretched out in frozen silence, a white wilderness lit only by moonlight. At 11:45 p.m., the crew gave the signal. The 6 commandos jumped into the darkness, parachuting into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The drop was scattered. The men landed miles apart in deep snow. Equipment containers were buried and difficult to locate, but they had trained for this. Within hours, all 6 men had regrouped. Now came the hard part, linking up with the grouse team. The grouse team was somewhere in these mountains, but where exactly? Radio communication was unreliable. German direction-finding units were listening for transmissions. The saboteurs would have to find them the old-fashioned way, by skiing through a blizzard in the middle of the night. For the next 5 days, the 2 teams searched for each other in the wilderness. The grouse team, Poulsen, Kjellstrup, Haugland, and Hellberg, had now been in the mountains for 4 months. They were exhausted, low on supplies, and suffering from malnutrition. But they refused to abandon their mission. Knut Haugland transmitted coordinates whenever conditions allowed, hoping Ronneberg's team would intercept them. But atmospheric interference made communication nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Ronneberg's team was facing their own challenges. Temperatures had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Winds were so strong they could barely move. Every step through the deep snow was exhausting. This wasn't just about finding each other. This was about survival. In these conditions, exposure could kill in hours. Frostbite could cost you fingers, toes, entire limbs. Several of the men were already showing symptoms, but these were some of the toughest men alive. They kept moving. They used every skill they had, reading the terrain, following old ski trails, using landmarks only locals would recognize. Finally, on February 23rd, after 5 days of searching, they found each other. 10 Norwegian commandos, reunited in the frozen mountains above Rjukan. Against all odds, they had survived. Now they had to complete the mission. For 3 days, the 10 men planned the assault from a small cabin in the mountains. Ronneberg laid out the intelligence. The grouse team had been observing the plant for months. They knew the guard rotations, the security measures, every detail of the defenses. The situation was worse than they'd hoped. After Operation Freshman, the Germans had turned Vemork into a fortress. Every obvious approach was covered by guards and machine guns. The suspension bridge, the main route into the valley, was a death trap. But the grouse team had discovered something, a possible way in that the Germans might have overlooked: the gorge. On the far side of the valley, opposite the main road, was a nearly vertical cliff face descending 600 feet to the river below. It was so steep, so treacherous, that the Germans assumed no one would be crazy enough to try climbing it, especially in winter. They were wrong. Ronneberg's plan was audacious. The team would descend the gorge under cover of darkness, cross the frozen river at the bottom, then climb up the opposite side directly beneath the plant. It would be exhausting, dangerous, and required perfect timing. But it was their only chance. The front gates were too heavily defended. The bridge was impossible. The gorge was suicide, but it was their only option. They prepared their equipment. Explosive charges were carefully packed. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Each man reviewed their role in the assault. Who would cut the fence? Who would place the charges? Who would cover their escape? On February 27, 1943, they were ready. That night, 9 men would make the assault. Poulsen would remain behind as a lookout, ready to warn them of any German response. As darkness fell, the team moved into position. They had one chance. If they failed, the German atomic bomb program would continue. If they were captured, they would be executed. But failure wasn't an option. Too much was at stake. They skied toward the gorge, their silhouettes disappearing into the frozen night. Operation Gunnerside had begun. At 8 p.m., the 9 commandos reached the edge of the gorge. Looking down, they could barely see the bottom. 600 feet of near vertical cliff, covered in snow and ice. One slip, one wrong move, and they would plummet to their deaths. Ronneberg went first. Using ropes and ice axes, he began the descent. The others followed, one by one, moving slowly and carefully through the darkness. The snow was deep and unstable. Every handhold had to be tested. The weight of their equipment, explosives, weapons, tools, made every movement exhausting. And they had to do this in complete silence. Any noise could alert the German guards above. For over an hour, they descended. Several times, men nearly fell. Equipment almost slipped loose. But they kept moving, inch by agonizing inch, until finally, they reached the bottom. The frozen river stretched before them, a white highway through the darkness. Behind them, the cliff they'd just descended looked impossible, like a wall no human could climb. But they had done it. The first obstacle was overcome. Now came the second impossible task, climbing up the other side. The far side of the gorge was even steeper than the descent. And now they were tired, cold, and running low on time. They had to reach the plant, complete the sabotage, and escape before dawn, before the guards changed shifts and the alarm could be raised. Once again, Ronneberg led the way, The climb was brutal. The men used trees and rocks as handholds, hauling themselves upward foot by foot. Several times they had to cut steps into the ice with their axes. Their hands were numb. Their legs burned with fatigue. The explosives on their backs seemed to grow heavier with every step. But quitting wasn't an option. They kept climbing. Finally, after another hour, they reached the top. They were now directly below the Wehrmacht plant, inside the German security perimeter. Above them, floodlights illuminated the facility. They could hear German voices, the sounds of guards on patrol. They were so close. But the most dangerous part was still ahead. The team moved silently toward the perimeter fence. This was the moment of maximum danger. If a guard spotted them now, the entire mission would fail. Frederick Kaiser and Caspar Eidlin moved forward with wire cutters. They worked quickly and carefully, cutting through the chain link fence, strand by strand, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The snap of each wire, the crunch of snow under their boots. In the distance, they could hear German guards talking, completely unaware that 9 armed men were cutting through their defenses. Within minutes, they had created an opening. One by one, the commandos slipped through the fence. They were inside the Wehrmacht plant compound. Now they split into 2 groups. The demolition team, Ronneberg, Kaiser, Stromsheim, and Storhaug, would enter the plant and place the explosives. The covering team, Haukelid, Kelstrup, Hellberg, Haugland, and Eidland, would secure the perimeter and protect their escape route. They had studied the layout for months. They knew exactly where to go. But nothing ever goes perfectly according to plan. The door they had planned to use was locked, secured with a heavy padlock they couldn't cut quietly. They had to find another way in. Ronneberg and Kaiser circled the building, staying in the shadows, avoiding the floodlights. Time was running out. Every minute they spent searching increased the chance of discovery. Then Kaiser spotted it, a small cable duct leading into the basement. It was narrow, barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, but it was unguarded. This was their way in. Kaiser went first, crawling through the tight space with his explosives. Ronneberg followed. Inside, they found themselves in a dark corridor, exactly where they needed to be. The heavy water concentration cells were just ahead. Ronneberg and Kaiser moved through the basement like ghosts. Every sense was heightened. Every sound was analyzed. German guards were patrolling the floors above. They could hear footsteps, voices, and then they saw them. The 18 heavy water concentration cells standing in neat rows. Thousands of liters of heavy water, the lifeblood of the Nazi atomic program, right in front of them. This was what they had come for. This was what dozens of men had died to reach. Everything, all the training, all the suffering, all the risk, came down to this moment. Ronneberg and Kaiser worked quickly. They placed explosive charges on each cell, arranging them for maximum damage. The charges were small. They didn't need to destroy the building, just rupture the cells and contaminate the heavy water. They set the fuses for 30-second delays. That would give them just enough time to escape before the explosion, but not enough time for anyone to stop them. But then, disaster. They heard footsteps approaching. A German guard was coming down the stairs into the basement. Ronneberg and Kaiser froze. They had no time to hide. If the guard entered this room, he would see them immediately. They would have to fight, and gunfire would alert the entire garrison. the mission would be over. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The guard was seconds away from entering the room, and then the footsteps stopped. The guard paused at the top of the stairs, hesitated, and walked away. He never knew how close he came to discovering the sabotage. Ronneberg and Kaiser didn't waste time. They finished placing the charges, double-checked the fuses, and moved toward the exit. It was done. Now they just had to get out alive. At 1:15 a.m., Ronneberg lit the fuses. 30 seconds. That's all they had. The two men ran through the basement, back toward the cable duct. They squeezed through as fast as they could, emerging into the freezing night air. Outside, the covering team was waiting. "Run!" Ronneberg whispered. "Now!" The 9 commandos sprinted away from the plant, racing toward the perimeter fence. Behind them, inside the basement, the fuses burned down to nothing. Boom! The explosion wasn't massive, no fireball, no dramatic destruction. But inside the basement, the charges had done their job perfectly. All 18 concentration cells ruptured simultaneously, releasing thousands of liters of heavy water that flooded across the floor and drained away into the river. Immediately, alarms blared throughout the plant. German soldiers rushed from their barracks, searching for the attackers. Searchlights swept across the compound. Machine guns opened fire blindly into the darkness. But the commandos were already gone. They had reached the fence, slipped through, and were racing toward the gorge. Behind them, the Germans were in chaos. No one knew what had happened, where the attack came from, or where the saboteurs had gone. By the time the Germans realized what had been destroyed, the commandos had vanished into the frozen mountains like ghosts. Operation Gunnerside was a complete success. Not a single shot had been fired. Not a single commando had been injured. And the German atomic bomb program had been dealt a devastating blow. But the mission wasn't over. The commandos still had to escape from Nazi-occupied Norway. Within hours, thousands of German soldiers were scouring the mountains. They brought in tracking dogs, aircraft, and special mountain troops. They knew the saboteurs couldn't have gotten far in these conditions. But once again, the Norwegians' knowledge of the terrain saved them. The team split into small groups, each taking different escape routes. They skied for days through blizzards, covering over 200 miles through some of the most brutal wilderness in Europe. Some of the men made it to Sweden, where they were interned as refugees before being secretly returned to Britain. Others, like Knut Haukelid, went underground in Norway, joining the resistance and continuing to fight the occupation. Incredibly, all 9 commandos survived. The Germans never caught them. The perfect mission had ended with a perfect escape. But what about the heavy water? Had the sabotage really stopped the Nazi atomic bomb? The explosion at Vemork had destroyed 6 months' worth of heavy water production and heavily damaged the concentration equipment. But the Germans didn't give up. They immediately began repairs and ordered production to resume. In November 1943, the Allies launched a massive bombing raid on Vemork, further damaging the facility. Faced with continued attacks, the Germans finally made a decision. They would abandon Vemork and move all remaining heavy water to Germany. In February 1944, the Germans loaded the last barrels of heavy water onto a ferry to transport them across Lake Tinn. But the Norwegian resistance had one last card to play. Knut Haukelid, one of the original Gunnerside commandos, snuck aboard the ferry and planted explosives in the hull. The ferry sank in the middle of the lake, taking the heavy water to the bottom where it remains to this day. The German atomic bomb program never recovered. After the war, Allied investigators examined the German nuclear program. Their conclusion was clear. Germany had never come close to building an atomic bomb. They had lacked the resources, the expertise, and most critically, the heavy water needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. The sabotage at Vemork, combined with the continued attacks, had set them back years. And by the time they might have recovered, the war was over. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. The weapons that ended World War II demonstrated the terrible power that nuclear weapons possessed. But imagine if Germany had developed these weapons first. Imagine if Hitler had atomic bombs in 1943 or 1944. London, Moscow, perhaps even Washington, D.C., all could have been targets. The entire course of human history could have been different. That didn't happen because of 9 men who parachuted into a frozen wilderness and destroyed a target many said was impossible to reach. They faced odds that would have broken most soldiers. They endured conditions that would have killed ordinary men. And they succeeded where a much larger force had failed. Joachim Ronneberg, the leader of Operation Gunnerside, lived to be 99 years old. He rarely spoke about the mission, considering it simply his duty. When asked about being called a hero, he would deflect, insisting he had just done what needed to be done. But history remembers. The sabotage of Vemork was one of the most successful special operations missions of World War II. It proved that courage, skill, and determination could triumph over overwhelming odds. 9 men stopped Hitler from getting the atomic bomb. They saved countless lives, and most of the world never knew their names. Operation Gunnerside, the mission that saved the world. If you want to learn more about this incredible story, there are several excellent books written about the mission, including The Real Heroes of Telemark by Ray Mears and The Winter Fortress by Neil Bascom. The story was also adapted into a film called The Heroes of Telemark, starring Kirk Douglas, though the movie takes significant creative liberties. Today, you can visit the Vemork plant, which has been converted into the Norwegian Industrial Workers Museum. The room where the sabotage took place is preserved as it was in 1943. The commandos who participated in Operation Gunnerside were awarded medals by multiple countries for their service. Norway, Britain, and even the United States recognized their extraordinary courage. This is just one of countless incredible stories from World War II. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in the face of impossible odds. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what World War II story you'd like to hear next. Thank you for watching,